Every single time civilization has cracked open, and it has cracked open, more times than your history textbook bothered to count, the same five groups appear. Not similar groups, not groups with the same general vibe, the exact same five groups with the exact same blind spots and the exact same fate waiting for most of them on the other side. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the fall of Rome, the Siege of Leningrad, the collapse of Venezuela's economy, or a small Midwestern town that lost power for 3 weeks in February. The pattern repeats with a precision that should unnerve you. Because here's the thing nobody is saying out loud. The group that survives is almost never the one people expect. It's almost never the strongest. It's almost never the most prepared. And it is almost never the one that formed with the loudest, most confident plan. So let's build all five from the ground up, from the first hour of a collapse to the brutal end of year one. Let's talk about what each group gets right, what each group gets catastrophically wrong, and why the line between survival and dissolution is almost always thinner than the groups themselves realize. But first, collapse doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't arrive with a thunderclap and the burning skyline in the first 20 minutes. Real collapse is a slow grind that disguises itself as a rough patch right up until the moment it becomes unrecoverable. The power goes out and people assume it'll be back by morning. The shelves go bare and people assume the trucks are just delayed. The bank limits withdrawals and people assume it's a glitch. There's a period, sometimes hours, sometimes weeks, where the collapse is happening in full swing, but the majority of the population is still operating on the assumption that normalcy is about to return. Psychologists call this normalcy bias, and it is the single most dangerous cognitive failure you can bring into a survival situation, because it converts the critical early window into wasted hours of comfortable waiting while the window quietly closes behind you. It is during that window, that strange, tense, liminal period between something is wrong and everything is gone, that the five groups begin to crystallize. Not through leadership summits or survival planning sessions. They form the way crystals form in a cooling solution, through the invisible pressure of personality, resources, ideology, and fear. By the time most people realize they've joined a group, they've already been shaped by it. The first group to form is always the Hoarders. They move fast, they move quietly, and in the first 48 to 72 hours, they are the most objectively rational people in the room. Think about that, because it matters. When the news breaks, when the shelves start emptying, when the first tremors of real panic begin to move through a community, the person who drives to the grocery store and loads a cart with rice and water jugs is not acting irrationally. They are responding to a genuine scarcity signal in a completely logical way. The problem is that their logic never evolves. The Hoarder's entire framework is built on a single equation. More resources equals more safety. And for the first week, maybe two, that equation is essentially correct. They have food when others don't, medicine when others don't, fuel, batteries, water, all the material prerequisites of short-term survival. If the collapse resolves quickly, the Hoarders win. They look smart, feel vindicated, quietly donate the extra canned goods to a food bank, and move on with their lives. But collapses that resolve quickly don't produce five groups. Quick disruptions produce inconvenience. The five-group pattern only emerges when the collapse goes long. And when it does, the Hoarder's equation breaks down in ways they never anticipated. Hoarding is an isolating behavior. By definition, you are pulling resources toward yourself and away from others. In the early days, this is tolerable because the social contract is still nominally intact. People may resent you, but they're not yet desperate enough to act on it. But as the collapse deepens, the Hoarder stockpile transforms from a private advantage into a public target. You are no longer the smart one who prepared. You are the one who has what everyone else needs, and you are almost certainly alone. This is the paradox at the core of the Hoarder's fate. The behavior that built their advantage systematically destroys their ability to defend it. A family with 3 months of food and 0 community relationships is not a fortress. It's a well-stocked target with no allies, no information network, no early warning system, and no one who would pick up a weapon to help them when it comes to that. There's also a second crack, quieter but just as lethal, and it's physiological. Hoarding is driven by anxiety. And anxiety, chronically elevated, does real damage. Elevated cortisol suppresses immune function, disrupts sleep, impairs judgment, and over weeks and months increases vulnerability to exactly the kind of illness a collapsed medical system cannot treat. The Hoarders feel safer than everyone else, but feeling safer and being safer are two very different things, especially when your immune system is running on fumes. The Hoarders are stressed, they just don't know it yet. Notice the pattern forming? Good, because it gets darker. The second group forms almost simultaneously with the first, but from the opposite psychological direction. These are the Deniers. And unlike the Hoarders, who are at least doing something, the Deniers are the most numerically dominant and the most comfortable to be around, which is part of what makes them so dangerous. They are not stupid people. They are people whose cognitive architecture is optimized for stable environments, and when stability vanishes, they respond not with panic, but with a deep, almost medicinal calm. Things will be fine. The government will handle it. This happened before and it sorted itself out. In normal times, this trait is genuinely valuable. It anchors panicking neighbors. It maintains social cohesion during temporary disruptions. But during a real collapse, denial is a death sentence written in pleasant handwriting. The Deniers don't feel fear. They feel calm. That's worse. What makes this group so fascinating from a survival perspective is that they aren't suppressing their fear. They genuinely don't feel it. Or more precisely, they have routed their fear through a cognitive bypass that converts incoming threat signals into reassurance outputs. Under extreme uncertainty, the brain sometimes defaults to familiar behavioral scripts rather than adaptive responses, because familiar scripts have a track record, and abandoning them requires you to accept that your past strategies, your past relationships to systems and authority and normalcy are now liabilities rather than assets. That is not a small thing to ask of a human mind. So the Deniers keep going to work, metaphorically speaking. They keep waiting for institutions to respond. They keep expecting the chain of command to restore order. And every day without adaptation is a day where the gap between their resource situation and their actual needs widens. When denial finally breaks, and it always breaks, usually through direct personal loss, they are weeks behind every other group. No stockpile, no allies, no skills, no plan. And the psychological whiplash of transitioning from everything is fine to nothing is fine produces paralysis rather than action. The denial group doesn't collapse, it dissolves, scattering into the other four groups as individuals finally wake up and scramble for footing. Now here's where the pattern changes, because the third group doesn't have a fatal flaw buried under layers of good intentions. The third group's flaw is the foundation itself. These are the Warlords. And I'm using that term loosely, because not every version drives around with skull flags. Sometimes it's a neighborhood association that stops being a neighborhood association and starts controlling who gets access to the shared well. Sometimes it's a family patriarch who decides his 5 acres and gun collection make him the de facto authority over the surrounding quarter mile. The aesthetic varies, the underlying dynamic does not. Warlords win the first fight.
They lose the last war. The warlord group forms around concentrated force, physical, material, or social, and in the immediate aftermath of collapse, when official authority has evaporated and the vacuum is terrifying, a lot of people will voluntarily attach themselves to any structure that promises order and protection. This is not weakness. This is an ancient human response that served our ancestors well for 100,000 years. When the environment becomes unpredictable and dangerous, attaching yourself to a dominant coalition is often your best short-term bet. But warlord systems have a problem embedded in their foundation. They require constant resource extraction to maintain power. You keep people loyal through provision and force, and both cost resources. When the provision model starts to fail, and in a collapsed economy, surpluses are not reliably maintained, warlord systems lean harder on force, which means increasingly aggressive extraction from an increasingly resentful population. Every historical example of this structure follows the same escalating cycle. The harder the grip tightens, the faster the cracks appear. And when a warlord system collapses, it collapses violently, because the entire social architecture has been built on suppressed resentment rather than real consent. Here's something important to understand clearly, because survival culture often gets this wrong. Any serious community in a collapse needs a capacity for physical defense. That part is true. But the warlord mindset, violence as organizing principle rather than available tool, is not the same thing as tactical capability. Individuals with real skill, clear thinking under pressure, physical capability, measured risk tolerance, those people can and should be absorbed into any serious survival community. The ones who are there specifically for the power structure, the ones who need the hierarchy to feel themselves, those are the ones who corrode everything they touch. There's a difference between absorbing tactical skill and importing a warlord culture. One makes you safer, the other makes you fragile in ways that don't become visible until the worst possible moment. The idealists are different. Telling their story through a simple formula would be wrong, because they almost got it right, and almost is the cruelest distance in survival. Imagine the founding days of an idealist community. It is extraordinary. The conversations are rich, warm, genuinely hopeful. People are talking about what kind of community they want to build, not just what they need to survive. They share resources more freely than any other group, make decisions more collectively, maintain higher morale in the early stages. If you were dropped into a collapse scenario tomorrow with no preparation and had to choose a group by feel alone, the idealist group would feel the best, by a significant margin. There is real trust here. Shared values create actual bonds, and actual bonds are a remarkably powerful social lubricant. But here is the quiet truth about idealism. It has a specific vulnerability that only emerges when values and necessity come into direct conflict. And in a collapse, that conflict doesn't arrive slowly. It arrives fast and it hits hard. The first version usually involves external threat. An idealist community built on principles of openness and nonviolence is genuinely admirable, right up until a warlord group decides those principles make them an easy target. The moment the idealists have to decide about force, do we defend ourselves? Do we compromise what we said we believed? Do we do the thing we said we would never do? The community fractures, not because people are hypocrites, because values that were abstract become concrete, and concrete values turn out to be more varied than the founding conversation suggested. Some members discover they will do whatever it takes. Others discover they will not, and the rupture between those positions inside a community built on moral solidarity is devastating in a way that purely pragmatic communities never experience. The second version of the conflict is internal and slower. Idealist communities often resist hierarchy on principle, which means they resist the mechanisms that allow rapid, decisive action. Collective decision-making is extraordinary for building trust and buy-in. It is catastrophic for responding to emergencies. A governance model requiring consensus becomes a fatal bottleneck the first time a decision needs to be made in 20 minutes instead of 20 days. And the emotional fallout from that failure, from watching your carefully constructed model collapse under the weight of its own procedural ideals, tends to produce a cynicism that runs deeper than the cynicism of people who never believed in anything to begin with. This is not an argument against idealism. It's an argument that idealism without pragmatic architecture is not idealism. It's wishful thinking with good vocabulary. Idealists build the warmest fire. They just can't always keep it lit. The fifth group is the one that survives, and here's where you need to pay close attention, because this group is consistently misidentified by people who study collapse scenarios, and that misidentification has real consequences for how you think about your own preparation. The fifth group is not the most prepared, not the most armed, not the most ideologically coherent, not the most ruthless. The fifth group is the one that builds real interdependence early, maintains radical adaptability throughout, and grounds its social bonds in practical mutual benefit rather than fear, force, or abstract principle. The adaptive network forms around skills, not ideology and not resources. A group organized around resources is always vulnerable to resource depletion. A group organized around ideology is always vulnerable to ideological fracture. But a group organized around complementary skills and functional mutual need has a different kind of resilience because the value each member provides is not dependent on an external supply chain or an internal consensus. You need the person who knows how to purify water because you need clean water, not because of what they believe or what they own. You need the person who understands field medicine because people get hurt, full stop. The social bond in the adaptive network is not sentimental, it is practical, and practical bonds survive conditions that sentimental bonds cannot. The second defining characteristic of the adaptive network is that it recruits across the other four groups without trying to. As the Hoarders' isolation becomes untenable, some of them, the ones with enough self-awareness to recognize the trap they've built, start looking for community. The adaptive network absorbs them, and their resources become communal assets. As the denial group finally wakes up, some of those individuals bring unexpected skills and social capital the network needs. Even the idealist communities, as they fracture, shed individuals who still have their moral seriousness intact, but have shed the procedural rigidity. And those people are extraordinarily valuable because ethics inside of functional structure produce something genuinely rare. While the Hoarders are shopping, the Deniers are reassuring each other, and the nascent Warlords are counting their assets, the future members of the adaptive network are asking a different set of questions. Not what do I have, but what do we know? Not how do I protect my stuff, but who has the skills we're going to need? This shift in pronoun from I to we sounds small and feels enormous because it represents a genuine cognitive reorientation away from individual optimization and towards collective resilience. The skill inventory conversation is one of the most practical tools a forming group can deploy in the early stages. You sit down and map what every person actually knows how to do. Not job titles, not credentials. What do you actually know? Who can set a broken bone? Who has grown food at production scale, not just as a hobby? Who understands water systems? Who has experience negotiating conflict? Who can teach children effectively? Because a community that can't maintain its next generation isn't a community, it's a cohort with an expiration date. This exercise does two things simultaneously. It creates a functional inventory of communal capability, and it changes how people see each other. The accountant who nobody thought twice about in the old world becomes the person who understands how to manage resource distribution at scale. The quiet older woman with a kitchen garden becomes one of the most valuable people in the group. The ignored military medic suddenly becomes essential. People who felt peripheral discover they are load-bearing. People who felt powerful discover their old power was entirely dependent on systems that no longer exist. This leveling effect is not just emotionally meaningful, it creates a more accurate map of who actually has what the group needs. And in a collapse, accuracy is a survival tool. The adaptive network's relationship to resources is also fundamentally different from the hoarder model, and the difference runs deeper than generosity. In the adaptive network, resources are tracked and managed communally, which allows for much more precise calibration of consumption against actual need. A hoarder with 3 months of food for one family and no knowledge of their neighbor's situation cannot optimize their resource use against real community need. An adaptive network with the same total quantity of food distributed across multiple families, with a shared inventory and a distribution protocol, can stretch those resources significantly further while simultaneously maintaining the social bonds that make defense, information sharing, and skill deployment possible. There's a water scenario that makes this concrete. In post-disaster situations where water supply is disrupted, isolated households with stored water almost invariably miscalculate their consumption timeline, either by underestimating daily need or by failing to account for sanitation requirements beyond drinking. Stockpiles run out faster than expected, and by the time the household realizes this, their social network has deteriorated to the point where asking for help is both dangerous and ineffective. Communities that pooled water resources and implemented shared purification protocols consistently extended their effective water supply by 30 to 60%, simply through better visibility into collective consumption and the ability to implement conservation measures at scale. Clean water is not just a survival resource, it is a disease prevention system. And disease, not violence, is the leading killer in virtually every long-term collapse scenario in the historical record. The adaptive network understands this because its members are talking to each other continuously, and continuous conversations surfaces this kind of insight before it becomes a crisis rather than after. Information sharing is not an act of generosity here, it is rational self-interest. This matters most at the threat assessment level. In any collapse environment, threats are not uniformly distributed in space or time. There are areas that are safer,
There are times that are more dangerous. There are specific individuals and groups that represent specific risks. The ability to map those threats accurately, update that map continuously, and share it with the entire community is a survival capability that no isolated household can replicate. The adaptive network's information web, built from dozens of individual observations, checked against each other, synthesized through a structure that allows rapid dissemination, is qualitatively superior to anything the other four groups can manage. And in an environment where the wrong route home or the wrong timing of a supply run can be the last mistake you ever make, information quality is not an abstraction. It is the difference between people coming back and people not coming back. Now, the psychological dimension, because physical resources and practical skills are only part of the equation. The psychological architecture of a group determines how it handles the accumulation of losses that any long-term collapse inevitably produces. And collapse loss is not a single event. It is a continuous process. You lose infrastructure, then comfort, then some people you knew, then some people you loved, then assumptions you had about the world and your place in it. Each loss costs psychological energy, and psychological energy, like any resource, is finite. Groups that don't manage that burn tend to experience catastrophic failure at exactly the wrong moment. When the situation demands extraordinary collective effort, the emotional reserves are already gone, and individual members begin making desperate, short-sighted decisions that accelerate collapse rather than arrest it. The adaptive network is not immune to loss, but it has something the other groups don't: real community, which means distributed grief. When something terrible happens, there are people to sit with you, not because it's the kind thing to do, but because your well-being is directly connected to the group's operational capacity, and everyone knows it. There is no charity in this. There is something more durable than charity: functional solidarity. And in a survival context, functional solidarity is one of the most powerful psychological resources that exists. The anthropological record is illuminating here. Communities that survived extended hardship, siege conditions, famine, forced displacement, almost universally maintained their cohesion through rituals of shared meaning, communal meals, even when food was desperately scarce, communal storytelling, communal acknowledgement of the dead. These are not luxuries, they are load-bearing elements of psychological infrastructure. The adaptive network maintains these rituals not by explicit design, but because the bonds that underpin the network require regular reinforcement, and shared ritual is one of the most efficient reinforcement mechanisms available to human communities. Now comes the honest and uncomfortable part. Knowing all of this, understanding the 5 groups, understanding which one survives and why, does not automatically place you in the right one. Knowledge and behavior are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where most preparation fails. Almost everyone who has thought seriously about collapse scenarios has assumed at some level that they would end up in the adaptive network. Almost everyone has the self-image of the thoughtful, collaborative, practically minded survivor. And yet, every real-world disruption produces groups overwhelmingly composed of hoarders, deniers, and people cycling in and out of dynamics that look far more like warlordism than anything else. The adaptive networks that appear are exceptions, not rules. The reason is that the behavior required to build and maintain an adaptive network runs directly against the psychological currents that stress produces. Stress makes us contract toward the familiar and the personal. It makes us mistrust outsiders. It makes us hoard rather than share, hide rather than connect, defer to dominant voices rather than insisting on horizontal decision-making. Every instinct that stress activates is an instinct that pushes you toward the groups that don't make it. The adaptive network requires you to swim upstream against your own neurology at exactly the moment when swimming upstream is hardest. You cannot transform yourself into an adaptive network member by deciding to be one in hour 6 of a blackout. The decision has to be made now, lived now, practiced now, in the texture of ordinary daily life, in the choices you make about how to relate to the people around you when nothing is at stake. A garden is not just a food source, it is a reason to talk to your neighbors. A skill shared freely is not just generosity, it is a bond created. A relationship maintained consistently over years through low-stakes normal life becomes something you can actually lean on when nothing is normal anymore. The groups that survive a collapse are not formed in a collapse. They were formed years before it, through the accumulated texture of how people lived together when there was no emergency demanding anything of them. The adaptive networks that appear after disasters in tight-knit communities did not form after the disaster. They were always there, latent, and the disruption simply activated them. The 5 groups are not destiny.
They are tendencies, and tendencies, unlike fixed laws, respond to conscious effort applied before the moment of crisis. Because the one thing all 5 groups share, the one thing that cuts across the Hoarders and the Deniers and the Warlords and the Idealists and the adaptive networks, is that none of them believe, in the beginning, that they are on the wrong trajectory. Every Hoarder thinks their resources will be enough. Every Denier thinks normalcy will return in time. Every Warlord thinks their strength will hold. Every Idealist thinks their values will not crack under pressure. The difference between them is not certainty. Everyone carries certainty into a collapse. The difference is the kind of work you did before the certainty was tested, and whether, when the test came, the foundation you built was real.